Well, I did a Google search this week. Face of God, searched in Google Images. I was curious what would come up. At the top was Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, middle-aged male pointing his finger out to a young Adam. And then came all of these cloud pictures. Now, some of them were just clouds with light streaming through, but others had captured images of clouds that formed almost profile shapes. And there were others that had traditional images of Jesus superimposed over the clouds. And then there were screenshots from popular films. There was Morgan Freeman from Bruce Almighty. There was blue-eyed Caucasian Jesus from Mel Brooks' The Passion. And there was this celestial image of an eye made out of stars and galaxies, this giant eye of the universe. There were word-carved faces, and there were these ancient, crumbling faces that had been painted, no doubt, on walls of old sacred sites. There were a few pictures of children, a few pictures of old men, a few pictures of old women. There were even a few pornographic images. When the religious leaders of Jesus' day were trying to trap this out-of-the-box renegade rabbi, they confronted him in the temple and they asked whether they should pay taxes. Jesus responds brilliantly. He picks up one of their coins and he looks it over, like our coins that had the relief of their ruler on it, Caesar. And he tells them, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. Well, that sounds nice, doesn't it? Simple, easy. Except there's one little hiccup in that. We don't have coins with God's face on them, do we? So when we talk about responding to God's gifts, as we have for the last 5 weeks, what does that look like? How do we know what is a gift from God? How do we know what has the imprint of God on it? And what does it look like to give back those things that have God's imprint on them? The images I found on Google aren't particularly helpful in answering this question. I'm not really sure how to respond to a profile-shaped stack of clouds in the sky. If that's the face of God and where I see God's imprint, do I stop polluting so the clouds will be as pure as possible? Well, I suppose working on my contribution solution would be such a bad thing, but I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. The Hebrew people out in the desert had struggled to find the face of God. From the moment they started wandering out there, they had constantly been losing their patience with God, and God had been losing God's patience with them as well. They were learning, as Dr. Brueggemann writes, how to host the holy. And they blundered most of their first attempts. I'm sure it wasn't easy to figure out how to host a God who was, on the one hand, so personal and relatable that Moses could meet night after night with God in a tent, just like a friend. And on the other hand, was so mysterious and other, so vast and so grand, so infinite, that when God passed by, you couldn't look God directly in the face. But instead you had to look at the edges of God. It's kind of like the way when we look directly at the sun, we lose our sight. And instead we have to look at all the things that the sun shines on. Well, the Bible talks about the face of God in two really important ways that I think help us figure out how we respond to God's gifts. The first comes in the book of Genesis. We hear about this thing called the imago Dei, the image of God. And we're told that we, human beings, male and female, are created in the imago Dei, the image of God. And we're told that all of creation bears the goodness of our Creator, God. So everything we encounter in this natural world, in one way or another, bears the imprint of God. Now, the second thing comes in a teaching moment between Jesus and his disciples. Concerned about their general inclination to turn away the needy, Jesus sits down with the disciples and he explains that whenever they encounter someone in need, someone who's hungry or naked or homeless, they're meeting him face to face. It makes sense, really, if God's glory is too overwhelming to look at directly, and if we have to look at the edges, things on which God's love shines, then of course we should look at those Jesus calls blessed. The poor, the meek, the grief-stricken, the hungry, the merciful, the peacemakers. Earlier this week, I read a blog post that one of my friends had posted on Facebook. It was written by a woman who had traveled to Kenya to assist an aid organization. And when she was leaving, she let her church know, and they asked her, well, is there anything we can do to help support this organization? Well, she told them, well, I'm planning to give the head of the organization an iPhone so that she can communicate via email and text and Skype and phone calls with people who are supporting this organization all around the world. She said, if you could help us with that, that would be really great. So the church emails went out, the mass emails, and the title was, Need Used Cell Phone, Use iPhone. Well, they found one for her. Someone gave her one that was several versions out of date, and she took it with her, only to discover once she got there that it couldn't hold the charge anymore. She ended up having to give the coordinator her own phone. When she returned, the church asked her how their gift had been received. She explained that it had been pretty much useless, and that she had had to give her own phone. Well, right away, the church wanted to make it right. So they told her, well, can we buy you the newest, latest iPhone out there? And when she told them that she had already replaced her phone, they said, well, can we give you $500 to make up for this? She directed them to give it to the aid organization. The woman lamented in her blog post that so often what we offer to the poor are our leftovers. Crap, as she puts it. Stuff that we ourselves would never use. The church had been so quick to want to give her the latest and greatest technology because she deserved it, as they put it. But when it came to helping someone poor in another country, they had only thought to ask for leftovers. And they sent something that didn't even function. What this communicated, she said, is that they didn't think the poor deserved the best, but instead only their worst. At the end of her post, she quoted Anne Voskamp. Some of you may have heard of her book, 1,000 Gifts, A Dare to Live Fully, right where you are. And here's what this blogger quoted. She says, we're not giving what we're called to give unless it affects how we live. It affects what we put on our plate and where we make our home and hang our hat and what kind of threads we've got to have on our back. Surplus giving is the leftover we can afford to give. Sacrificial giving is the love gift that changes how you live, because the love of Christ has changed you. Friends, I invite you, look around this morning. Where do you see the face of God? Jesus says you'll see it in the poor and the meek and the grief-stricken, the hungry, the merciful, the peacemakers, the ones whom God bathes in the light of God's love. Genesis tells us that we will see it in all of creation. We will see it in the beauty and the fearfulness and the wonder of God's imprint on things that are wonderfully simple and things that are more intricate and powerful than we can ever imagine. Moses' question for us this morning is, how will we as a community host the holy in our midst? And Jesus' question for us is, how will we respond to a God who gives us God's best? How will we respond where we see God's imprint throughout our lives? Roy and Gretchen shared with us a little of where they see us and how they see Good Sam responding. I wonder, what would it look like for you to give your best to God's beloved this year? What would it look like for our church community if we gave our best to God's beloved? Are we willing to make that sort of sacrifice? Are we willing to move beyond leftovers to our first overs? Our love overtures in response to a God whose love for us is absolutely overwhelming. May God be with us.